Okay, so in the next few minutes, I'm going to cover deflationary spirals in the IS-LM-LPC model. If you aren't familiar with the model at all, I have another video on that, so you can check that out. I'll link it somewhere around here. So we can start by just setting up the model generally, so I'll do that now. Now, a concept we're going to run into in thinking about deflationary spirals is the lower zero bound, and that's just going to be the fact that you can't go under zero on the nominal interest rate. So we're going to think about that in a second, but for now we're just looking at output on the x-axis, and then we have the Phillips curve, which is going to be on this graph. That's upward sloping, and then we have, right, the downward sloping IS model, line right here. Now we know that the natural rate of output that we're aiming for is going to be right here where inflation is constant. And then we can denote this as just y subscript n. Now if we pull this up to the IS curve, we can see that we're at this point on the curve. Now, I want to note a few things just about this situation where we currently are. And let's say, for example, that to denote, again, a deflationary cycle, that we're right here. So currently, this is the natural rate, and then this is where we currently are. This right here essentially is the negative output gap. So the negative output gap is going to be, or any kind of output gap, whether positive or negative, is the difference between the natural rate of output and the current output. So if this is positive, you have a positive output gap and vice versa. So in this case, we have a pretty big negative gap in that we are well below the natural rate of output. Now, the problem with that is that we're right here. And so if you just pull that down, we are below zero on the Phillips curve, right? So zero inflation is here, and remember this just denotes essentially the difference, the spread in inflation. So we know for a fact that inflation is below the level of zero, whatever that rate may be. And so the problem with that in thinking about the deflationary cycles is that we can think about, well, what the real interest rate is. So let me write that a bit better. We know that the real interest rate is going to be the nominal interest rate minus inflation, right? For example, if we know that the Feds set the nominal interest rate to 3% and then inflation is 1%, then we know that the real interest rate, again, just the inflation rate adjusted for inflation, is going to be 2%, right? Just 2 equals 3 minus 1. Well, the problem with this is that we have this lower zero bound here. We have essentially a resource constraint. So what that means is that we know that the nominal interest rate here has to be greater than or equal to 0. So if the real interest rate, it's going to be some value, and we want to really figure out, is this going to be negative or is this going to be positive, because that affects then output. We know that this has to be above 0, so then the nominal interest rate is going to be positive. But then in this situation where we have this really big negative output gap, then we know that the inflation is negative or below 0, right? That's right here. So if we pull that over, we have a positive value minus some kind of negative value, whatever that may be. Well, the problem with that is that, well, two negatives are going to bring about a positive. So now we have two positives. So therefore we know that the real interest rate is going to be some positive value. Now the problem with that is then if we think about, well, how do real interest rates affect output? The real interest rate is kind of like the opportunity cost of money, where if you can make more money by just storing your money in a bank because it's earning interest, well, then you're not going to pursue, say, more economically productive things like investing that capital. So what that means is as real interest rates rise, then output, or let's say GDP, is going to go down. And what happens when GDP goes down or output goes down? Well, inflation also is going to go down. Now that's important, and then we can return to the graph, and you'll see how this connects in just a minute here. Well, the Feds, right, they want to get us from this point right here, we can call that just let's say R prime. They want to get us from R prime back down to this natural point. So let's say R of n to correlate with the natural rate of output. To do that, they need to lower the real interest rate. So let's say they do lower it, and let's say they lower it, as we know, as low as it can go to the value of 0. That's going to be right here on the graph, right? Well, that is going to bring us further to the right, so it will increase output to some extent, and it'll bring us to this point on the Phillips curve. So we'll denote that just y prime, and we can call this r prime, which we know is equivalent to 0. So we're right here now, which means the output gap is only this little piece right here, as opposed to the larger area prior. But the problem with this is that we know, we just did the math here, right, that the real interest rate is still going to be positive. And that's because even when, given this 0 lower bound constraint here, even when the Feds drops the interest rate all the way to 0, the output is still at this value, which is still below 0 when we think about inflation. And so inflation is negative, and inflation being negative, and inflation being, the resource constraint being 0, that means that we're driven back to, if we just set this up again, this is equivalent to 0. So the real interest rate is equivalent to 0 plus then a negative inflation rate. This is a negative. So we have that two negatives that bring us to a positive value when we think about the real interest rate. And in turn, again, like we just spoke of, the real interest rate being positive is actually going to do the exact opposite, right? The real interest rate being positive is going to pull us back up, right? It's essentially this movement up. It's going to pull us back up this curve, and it's going to pull us back down the Phillips curve, which is going to decrease output and make this whole problem cyclically worse. Because if output is going down and then the real interest rate is going up, then inflation also just continues to go down. And since the value here is going to be the negative of the negative, then the inflation going down is going to make this whole value larger. So it's effectively going to keep raising the real interest rate. And that's how you get what's called this deflation trap or spiral, where everything just somehow gets worse and the Fed can't, or any government, central bank can't really do much about it, at least with these monetary tools, because they already dropped the rate to 0 and they can't go below that. So that in sum is how, with the IS-LM-LPC model in mind, you can model out deflationary spirals.